The battle had ended 20 minutes ago. At least, that was what the enemy believed. Commander Roland Thur stood on the shattered bridge of the cruiser Vanguard Reach, watching the debris of his fleet drift silently across the orbit of Kelry's Prime. 43 ships had entered the system 6 hours earlier. Only 3 remained. The rest had become drifting wreckage. Burned hull fragments rotated slowly through the cold vacuum outside the viewport, their navigation lights long extinguished. Somewhere among those fragments were thousands of crew members who had not survived the engagement. Across the bridge, the tactical display showed the truth with brutal clarity. 72 enemy warships still held formation around the planet. They had not even taken serious damage. The Dravari Dominion fleet floated like a wall of iron between the colony world below and the remaining defenders above. A transmission signal chimed. The massive image of Warlord Kreth Verwin filled the central display. His species had been bred for war long before most civilizations had discovered faster-than-light travel. Thick armored skin covered his face like natural plating. The long scars across his jaw were not decorations. They were a record, 100 previous victories, etched into bone. He studied the ruined human fleet with slow, satisfied eyes. "Commander Thur," the warlord said calmly, "you fought well, but the outcome is obvious." Behind him, the enormous Dominion flagship loomed like a moving fortress. "You have 20 minutes to transmit your formal surrender." The bridge was silent. Then the sensors began to scream. Lieutenant Mara Kessler snapped upright at her console. "Commander, we have incoming contacts." Thur didn't turn. "How many enemy reinforcements?" There was a pause. Her voice changed. "Not enemies, sir." Another pause. "Unknown fleet, emerging from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system." The entire bridge went still. "How many ships?" Thur asked quietly. Kessler stared at the sensor readout. 49. Another officer leaned over her station. "What faction are they?" Kessler swallowed. "Their transponders just activated." She looked up slowly. "They're human." For several seconds, no one on the bridge moved. Commander Roland Thur finally turned from the viewport and walked slowly toward the tactical display. The sensor map expanded across the center of the bridge, showing the entire Kelry system. At its center floated the Dravari Dominion fleet. 72 warships, heavy cruisers, assault carriers, gun platforms, and the enormous flagship Iron Judgment, which alone carried enough firepower to cripple most planetary defenses. Around them drifted the wreckage of the defense fleet. Below them, the colony world of Kelry's Prime rotated slowly in darkness. Nearly 2 million civilians had taken shelter in underground structures hours earlier when the first orbital bombardment began. They were waiting to see whether the fleet above them would hold. Thur already knew the answer. It had not. The Dominion fleet had broken through the outer defensive perimeter 3 hours into the engagement. After that, the battle had been little more than a controlled dismantling of the remaining ships. The Dravari were patient enemies. They never rushed victory. On the central screen, Warlord Kreth Verwin was still watching. He had heard the sensor alarm. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Commander," the warlord said slowly, "your crew appears concerned." Thur ignored the question. He turned toward Lieutenant Kessler. "Confirm identification." Kessler ran the sensor verification twice before answering. "Transponders match human fleet registry codes, sir." 49 vessels. Another officer looked up from the tactical board. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "No human fleet was assigned to this sector." He was right. The nearest Terran fleet group was stationed nearly 2 weeks away at maximum FTL speed. No distress signal had been sent to them. The battle had started too quickly, which meant the obvious question had no answer. "How did they know we were here?" someone whispered. Kessler zoomed the sensor display outward. The new contacts had appeared at the far edge of the system, nearly 30 million kilometers away. But they were already moving. Fast. "They're accelerating," she said. Commander Thur studied the formation. It wasn't a formation at all. The 49 ships were clustered in a narrow, angled wedge that pointed directly toward the Dominion fleet. They had not spread out to establish defensive spacing. They had not slowed down to evaluate the battlefield. They had not even changed course. They were simply accelerating, straight toward the enemy. On the display behind Warlord Verwin, several Dominion officers began speaking rapidly to each other. The warlord raised one hand, silencing them without turning his head. "Human vessels," he said thoughtfully. They appear eager. One of the Dominion commanders spoke from off-screen. Warlord, our analysis indicates they will enter weapons range in 12 minutes. Verowyn leaned slightly forward. Open a channel. The transmission connected instantly. Across the system, every active ship suddenly heard the same deep voice. This is Warlord Kreth Verowyn of the Dravari Dominion. To the unidentified human fleet entering this system. A short pause followed. You are approaching an active Dominion military operation. The defending fleet has already been defeated. The warlord gestured lazily toward Thur's damaged cruiser. Transmit your identification and stand down. The human fleet did not respond. Lieutenant Kessler checked the communications board. No outgoing signal detected, she reported. They heard him, Thur said. Everyone heard him. The Dominion broadcast was powerful enough to reach the far side of the system. On the tactical display, the 49 human ships continued accelerating. Their engines burned bright against the darkness of space. Still no change in course. Still no response. Warlord Verowyn waited another moment. Then he spoke again. Human fleet, this is not a request. You are entering a combat zone controlled by the Dominion. You will reduce speed immediately and prepare to depart the system. The silence that followed felt heavier this time. 10 seconds passed. 20. Still no response. Then Lieutenant Kessler stiffened. Commander. Thur looked at her. Yes. We're receiving a transmission. From the human fleet. Put it on the main channel. The screen flickered once. The Dominion warlord remained visible on one side of the display. On the other side, a new figure appeared. A woman in a dark Terran fleet uniform. She looked calm. Not angry. Not frightened. Just focused. Her eyes moved briefly across the screen, taking in the alien warlord, the damaged ships behind Commander Thur, and the tactical display of the battlefield. It took her less than 2 seconds. Then she spoke. This is Fleet Admiral Elena Ward, she said. Her voice was steady, commanding the 7th Human Vanguard Fleet. The bridge crew exchanged quick glances. 7th Vanguard Fleet. No one had heard of it. Admiral Ward continued. We detected your engagement 11 days ago through long-range listening stations. Our fleet departed immediately. She looked directly at Warlord Verowyn. Her gaze didn't waver. We have now arrived. There was no anger in her voice. No threat. Just a simple statement of fact. To the Dominion fleet, she said calmly. This battle is not over. For the first time since the transmission began, Warlord Verowyn smiled. It was not a friendly expression. Admiral Ward, he said slowly. You command 49 ships. I command 72. The tactical display appeared beside him, clearly showing the difference in fleet strength. You have arrived too late. This system already belongs to the Dominion. He leaned slightly closer to the camera. Stand down. A quiet pause followed. Admiral Ward studied the tactical display for a moment. She looked at the wreckage, the colony below, the debris of thousands of lives already lost. Then she looked back at him. That, she said softly, is about to change. The transmission ended. Across the bridge of the Vanguard Reach, no one spoke. Lieutenant Kessler stared at the tactical display. Commander, Thur didn't look away from the screen. Yes, the human fleet is still accelerating. How fast? Kessler checked the numbers again. Her voice dropped slightly. Maximum engine output. She looked up. They're not slowing down. On the display, 49 human warships burned across the dark like a spear of fire, and they were heading directly toward the Dominion fleet. For the next several minutes, the entire system watched the same thing unfold. 49 human warships continued accelerating toward the Dominion fleet. They did not slow down. They did not spread into standard combat formations. They did not open communication again. They simply kept coming. On the bridge of the Vanguard Reach, Lieutenant Kessler enlarged the sensor display until the approaching fleet filled half the screen. Time to engagement? Commander Thur asked. 8 minutes, she said. Another officer leaned closer to the console. They're maintaining a tight cluster, he said. That spacing is too narrow for safe maneuvering. He zoomed further. The ships were arranged in a long angled wedge. At the front of the formation were the largest vessels, heavy cruisers and carrier platforms. Behind them followed destroyers and support ships. But the spacing was wrong. No navy flew like that. Every military doctrine across the compact recommended wide dispersal during approach to avoid concentrated enemy fire. The human fleet was doing the opposite. They were compressing. They're making themselves easier targets, the officer muttered. Commander Thurs studied the pattern silently. After 30 years of combat command, he had learned to trust a certain instinct. Something about the movement on the screen felt deliberate, not reckless, calculated. Across the battlefield, the Dominion fleet had also noticed. On the transmission display, Warlord Kreth Verowyn had turned slightly away from the camera while his tactical officers spoke rapidly around him. One of them pointed toward a projection showing the approaching human ships. Verowyn listened for several seconds. Then he turned back toward the transmission. "Admiral Ward," he said, reopening the channel. "You appear to be mistaken about your situation. You are approaching a superior fleet without defensive formation. You are accelerating into weapons range. And you are doing so in a cluster that will allow my ships to eliminate you quickly." He paused slightly. "Explain this decision." Admiral Ward looked at the display for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "No," she said. The warlord blinked once. "Excuse me." Ward's expression did not change. "We are not here to explain our decisions." The channel closed again. On the Dominion flagship, several officers began speaking at once. Verowyn raised a hand. Silence returned instantly. For a moment, he simply watched the approaching ships. Then he gave his first order. "Deploy the gunship line." Across the Dominion formation, 12 heavy gunships broke away from the main fleet and moved forward. Each vessel carried multiple long-range plasma batteries designed specifically for fleet interception. Their job was simple: destroy anything approaching the Dominion battle line before it could close the distance. On the tactical display aboard the Vanguard Reach, the new formation appeared like a shield between the human fleet and the rest of the Dominion ships. "They're setting up a defensive wall," Kessler said. Commander Thur nodded slowly. "Standard Dominion strategy. Overwhelming firepower at long range. Enemy fleets rarely survive the first pass." Behind the gunships, the remaining 60 Dominion vessels held position in tight formation around the enormous flagship Iron Judgment. The message was clear: the humans would never reach them. Across the void, the human fleet continued accelerating. 5 minutes to engagement. 4. 3. On the human flagship Resolute Dawn, the bridge was quiet except for the steady flow of data across the tactical displays. Fleet Admiral Elena Ward stood near the center of the command deck. Around her, officers moved with calm efficiency. "Distance to enemy gunship line?" she asked. 200,000 kilometers, the navigation officer replied. "Closing rapidly." Weapons Officer Lieutenant Aaron Malik glanced up from his targeting console. "Enemy batteries are charging. They'll open fire in about 60 seconds. Ward nodded once. "Understood." She turned slightly toward the helm station. "Maintain course." The navigator hesitated. "Admiral, we are still on direct intercept with the gunship formation." "Yes. We will enter their primary firing arcs." Ward looked at the tactical screen. The Dominion gunships had formed a wide line across the human fleet's path. Each one was armed with heavy plasma cannons capable of destroying a cruiser with a few sustained hits. There was plenty of time to adjust course. The navigator knew it. So did everyone else on the bridge. Ward didn't issue a new order. "Maintain course," she repeated. The navigator swallowed. "Yes, Admiral." Across the fleet, identical commands moved through every human ship. "Maintain course. Do not slow down. Do not spread out." The distance continued shrinking. 100,000 kilometers. 80,000. On the Dominion gunships, targeting systems locked onto the incoming fleet. One of the tactical officers on Verowyn's flagship spoke quietly. "Warlord, the humans are still not maneuvering." "They will," he said. "Eventually." But the humans didn't. 60,000 kilometers. 50. 40. Weapons energy readings spiked across the Dominion gunships. On the bridge of the Vanguard Reach, Lieutenant Kessler leaned forward suddenly. "They're firing." 12 Dominion gunships unleashed their first volley. Brilliant streams of plasma fire tore across the void toward the approaching human fleet. The light from the blasts illuminated half the system. On the human flagship, the weapons officer counted the incoming trajectories. "Enemy fire detected," Malik said. "Impact in 9 seconds." The navigator glanced at Admiral Ward. "Evasive maneuvers?" Ward shook her head. "No." The bridge crew looked at her. "Hold formation," she said. "Maintain full acceleration." 9 seconds passed quickly. On the Vanguard Reach, the entire bridge crew watched the sensor display in silence. The Dominion barrage raced toward the human fleet. At this range, it was impossible to dodge completely. The first impacts would happen any moment. Commander Thur found himself leaning forward slightly. If the humans broke formation now, they might survive the initial attack. If they didn't, the first explosions appeared across the human formation. Multiple ships were struck by plasma fire. The tactical display flashed with warning indicators. Several vessels took direct hits. But something strange happened. The human fleet did not scatter. It did not slow down. It did not retreat. The ships simply continued forward, straight through the incoming fire. Lieutenant Kessler blinked. They're still accelerating. Commander Thur stared at the screen. Across the battlefield, the human ships pushed through the Dominion barrage like a storm moving through heavy rain. Hull armor glowed from energy impacts. Shields flared violently. But the formation held. 49 ships, still moving forward, still accelerating. Behind them, burning plasma trails drifted across space. Ahead of them, the Dominion gunship line prepared to fire again. On the Dominion flagship, one of the officers spoke quietly. Warlord, they didn't break. Veroin watched the sensor display carefully. His expression had changed slightly. Not fear. Not yet. But something else. Interest. He leaned closer to the tactical projection. Fire again, he ordered. Across the gunship line, the second volley began charging. But the distance between the fleets was now closing much faster than expected. 30,000 kilometers. 25. 20. On the Vanguard reach, Lieutenant Kessler's voice dropped. Commander, they're going straight through the gunship line. Commander Thur didn't answer, because he was starting to understand what the human fleet was doing. And if he was right, the Dominion fleet was about to have a very bad day. The distance between the two fleets collapsed faster than any commander in the system expected. The Dominion gunship line had been designed to destroy approaching fleets before they reached close combat range. It had worked in dozens of wars across 2 centuries of Dominion expansion. Enemy ships usually slowed when they realized what they were facing. They spread their formations. They tried to dodge. Sometimes they even retreated. The human fleet did none of those things. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Lieutenant Malik watched the targeting screen fill with enemy ships. Range to gunship line. 15,000 kilometers, he reported. Admiral Ward stood behind him with her arms folded calmly. Prepare strike groups. Across the fleet, identical orders moved through 48 other ships. Each vessel began adjusting its course by only a few degrees. The formation shifted slightly. Not a retreat. Not a defensive maneuver. Something else. On the Dominion flagship Iron Judgment, Warlord Veroin noticed it immediately. The humans are adjusting course, one of his officers said. Explain the pattern. The tactical officer zoomed the sensor projection. Small red indicators began appearing across the Dominion gunship line. Warlord, each human ship is targeting a different gap in our formation. What gaps? The officer highlighted them. The gunship line had been arranged quickly, 12 ships spaced evenly across a massive defensive arc. But even the best defensive wall had openings between vessels. Small ones, normally irrelevant. But the human fleet had identified every single one. And every human ship was aiming for one. On the Vanguard reach, Commander Thur realized it at the same moment. They're not trying to destroy the gunship line, he said quietly. Lieutenant Kessler looked up. Then what are they doing? Thur pointed at the display. They're going through it. The distance shrank again. 10,000 kilometers. 8,000. 6,000. Across the Dominion gunships, weapons batteries fired their second full barrage. The void between the fleets exploded with plasma fire. Several human ships took direct hits. One cruiser at the edge of the formation erupted in a violent explosion and vanished from the sensor board. Another vessel spun slightly from the impact of a heavy plasma strike. But it didn't stop. It kept moving. On the Resolute Dawn, the navigator gripped her controls tightly. Admiral, incoming fire across the formation. I see it, Ward said calmly. Stay on target. Range 5,000 kilometers, Malik said. The Dominion gunships fired again. And again, multiple human vessels began showing damage warnings across the tactical displays. Hull integrity dropping. Shield systems failing. Still they kept coming. Across the Vanguard Reach Bridge, one of the surviving officers whispered in disbelief. They're flying into the fire. Commander Thur watched the sensor board. No, he said quietly. They're flying through it. 4,000 kilometers. 3,000. The Dominion gunships began adjusting their positions, trying to close the gaps in their defensive line. But it was too late. The human ships were already too close. On the resolute dawn, the navigation officer called out, "Approaching intercept point. Execute." 48 human ships suddenly accelerated again. Not forward, sideways. Each vessel made a sharp course correction at the last possible moment. They slipped through the narrow gaps between the Dominion gunships at incredible speed. The maneuver was precise, dangerously precise. Several ships passed within a few hundred meters of the massive Dominion vessels. On the bridge of the Iron Judgment, the tactical officer stared at the screen in disbelief. They're inside the line. The gunship formation collapsed instantly. Their long-range weapons had been designed to fire forward. Now the enemy ships were everywhere. Between them, behind them, inside their firing arcs. On the resolute dawn, Lieutenant Malik locked onto the nearest Dominion gunship. Target acquired. Fire. The forward batteries erupted. Heavy railgun rounds slammed into the side of the massive Dominion vessel at close range. The gunship's shields collapsed under the impact. Moments later, its hull split open. Across the battlefield, identical scenes unfolded. Human ships attacked from point-blank range. At this distance, Dominion long-range weapons were almost useless. Several gunships tried to turn. They didn't have time. Within 30 seconds, the defensive line had shattered. On the Vanguard reach, Lieutenant Kessler watched the tactical board change rapidly. 3 Dominion gunships destroyed. 2 more disabled. The remaining vessels attempted to regroup, but the human fleet had already passed them. 48 ships, some damaged, some burning, burst through the broken line and accelerated toward the heart of the Dominion formation. Behind them, wreckage from the destroyed gunships drifted through space. Commander Thur leaned back slowly. "They did it," he said quietly. "They broke the line." On the Dominion flagship, Warlord Veruin watched the battle unfold in silence. The gunship wall that had protected his fleet for decades had collapsed in less than a minute. His officers were already issuing emergency commands. Reposition defensive ships. Bring cruisers forward. Prepare intercept pattern. Veruin didn't stop them, but his eyes stayed fixed on the human fleet. They were not slowing down. Not even now. Instead, they accelerated again. Straight toward the Dominion fleet center. Toward the Iron Judgment. One of the tactical officers spoke carefully. "Warlord, the human fleet is targeting the flagship." Veruin finally stood. For the first time in the entire engagement, he gave a defensive order. "Bring the fleet inward. Form a defensive ring around the flagship." Across the Dominion fleet, ships began maneuvering rapidly. Cruisers and destroyers shifted position, forming a tightening circle around the enormous flagship. They were no longer advancing. They were protecting something. On the Vanguard reach, Lieutenant Kessler noticed immediately. "Commander, the Dominion fleet is pulling back. They're defending the flagship." Thur exhaled slowly. For the first time in 6 hours, the battle had changed direction. The Dominion fleet had stopped attacking. And when an enemy stopped attacking, it meant they had started worrying. On the resolute dawn, Admiral Ward watched the Dominion formation tighten around the massive flagship. "Enemy fleet is shifting to defensive posture," Malik reported. Ward nodded slightly. "They understand the situation now." The navigator glanced up. "Admiral, the flagship is heavily protected." Ward studied the tactical display. Around the Iron Judgment, more than 30 Dominion warships had formed a defensive ring. A fortress of steel and weapons. Breaking through it would be extremely difficult, but not impossible. Ward turned toward the bridge crew. "Signal the fleet." Malik looked up. "Message, Admiral." Ward's voice was calm. "Tell them we are going deeper." Across the battlefield, 48 damaged but determined human ships accelerated toward the center of the Dominion formation. Behind them, the shattered gunship line burned in silence. Ahead of them waited the largest warship in the Dominion fleet. And the battle was only beginning. The battlefield changed shape. Where there had once been 2 clean formations, there was now chaos. Human ships had punched straight through the Dominion gunship line and were spreading across the interior of the enemy fleet like sparks in dry grass. Explosions flickered across the sensor displays. Damaged ships drifted. Weapons fire crisscrossed the void in every direction. And the distance between the fleets was shrinking to point-blank combat range. On the bridge of the resolute dawn, Lieutenant Aaron Malik moved faster than he had in any simulation. His targeting screens were filled with enemy signatures. Cruiser on bearing 042. Locking forward battery. The Dominion ship tried to turn its heavy cannons toward the human formation. Too slow. Malik fired first. 3 railgun rounds tore through the cruiser's shields and struck the hull seconds later. The enemy ship staggered under the impact. Target damaged. Retargeting. Another Dominion vessel appeared on the edge of the screen. Missile tubes ready. Fire. 2 missiles streaked forward and detonated against the cruiser's engine section. The ship went dark. Malik didn't celebrate. He had already moved to the next target. At the helm, Commander Tara Owens was doing something far more dangerous. She was flying between warships. Dominion vessels filled the tactical display. Some were thousands of meters long, and the Resolute Dawn was weaving between them at combat speed. Enemy cruiser crossing our path. Adjusting course. The ship rolled sharply. A massive plasma blast passed only meters behind them. Malik glanced sideways. That was close. Owens didn't look up. I know. Her eyes stayed locked on the navigation grid. She made another rapid calculation. Next gap opening in 5 seconds. Taking it. The flagship shot through a narrow opening between 2 Dominion destroyers. Both enemy ships tried to track them, but the angle was wrong. They couldn't turn their weapons fast enough. The human ship was already gone. Across the battlefield, the destroyer Hawking's Edge was barely holding together. A Dominion plasma strike had ripped open half its port side armor. Warning lights covered every screen on the bridge. Captain Daniel Reyes gripped the command rail as the ship shuddered again. Status report. His engineering officer answered immediately. Port shield generator destroyed. Engine output down to 40%. Structural integrity, holding for now. Reyes looked at the tactical map. The Dominion fleet was closing in around the human ships. If they slowed down now, they would be surrounded. Helm, Reyes said. Yes, Captain. Keep us in formation. The officer hesitated. Sir, we may not survive another direct hit. Reyes nodded once. I know. Outside the viewport, a Dominion cruiser appeared in their path. Forward guns ready, the weapons officer said. Reyes didn't hesitate. Fire everything. The Hawking's Edge unleashed its entire forward battery. The enemy cruiser took the hit across its midsection. Its shields collapsed instantly. The hull cracked open seconds later. The Dominion ship drifted out of formation. Reyes exhaled slowly. Good shot. The destroyer kept flying. Back on the Vanguard Reach, Commander Roland Thur watched the battle unfold with growing disbelief. The human fleet had entered the Dominion formation less than 10 minutes earlier, but the entire battlefield had changed. Dominion ships were turning in every direction, trying to track fast-moving human targets. Several vessels were already drifting with heavy damage, and the human fleet was still pushing forward. They're heading deeper into the formation, Lieutenant Kessler said. Thur nodded. I see it. The human ships were not trying to escape. They were moving toward the center, toward the massive Dominion flagship Iron Judgment. Commander, if they reach that ship. Thur finished the sentence quietly. The Dominion fleet loses its command center. He stared at the tactical map for several seconds. Then he turned toward his remaining officers. How many weapons systems do we still have operational? The weapons officer checked quickly. 2 forward cannons. Limited missile capacity. Thur nodded. That will have to do. The officer looked confused. Commander, Thur pointed at the tactical screen. The humans came here to help us. He looked at the wreckage of the destroyed fleet drifting outside the viewport. We are not finished yet. Kessler understood first. You want to re-enter the fight? Yes. Another officer spoke cautiously. Our ship is heavily damaged. We could lose power at any moment. That may be true. Thur turned back to the tactical display. But right now the Dominion fleet is focused on the humans. If we strike from behind, we split their attention. Kessler's eyes widened slightly. We split their attention. Thur smiled faintly. Exactly. He stepped toward the command console. Open a channel to the remaining defense ships. The signal connected quickly. 2 other damaged vessels appeared on the screen. Their captains looked exhausted. Commander Thur, we thought the battle was over. Thur shook his head. It was. He gestured toward the tactical display showing the human fleet advancing. But it appears someone else disagreed. The 2 captains watched the display. Explosions flickered across the battlefield. Human ships pushed forward despite heavy damage. One of the captains spoke quietly. What are you suggesting? Thur answered simply. We join them. Silence followed. Then the second captain nodded slowly. Our weapons are limited. That will be enough. Thur smiled slightly. Then prepare to move. On the bridge of the Vanguard Reach, Lieutenant Kessler watched the engines power up again. The damaged cruiser slowly turned toward the battlefield. For the first time in hours, the defense fleet was advancing. Not all of the fighting was happening in open space. On the human assault ship Titan's Resolve, Sergeant Marcus Hale stood in the airlock with 9 armored soldiers. Behind them, the magnetic clamps of their ship were locking onto the hull of a Dominion destroyer. The soldiers checked their weapons in silence. Hale looked at the small tactical screen on his wrist. Enemy crew estimate. A technician answered through the comm channel. 85 Dominion personnel on board. One of the soldiers glanced sideways. There are 10 of us. Hale nodded. Correct. The soldier waited. That's not great odds. Hale shrugged slightly. We're not here to fight 85 people. He looked around at his team. We're here to make them deal with us instead of the fleet outside. The airlock indicator turned green. Seal confirmed. Hale raised his weapon. Let's go. The door blew open. 10 human soldiers stormed into the enemy ship. The Dominion crew had never seen humans fight at close range before. They would remember it for the rest of their lives. For nearly 2 hours, the Dominion fleet had controlled the battlefield. Every movement had been predictable. Every engagement had followed the same pattern that had brought the Dravari Dominion victory in dozens of wars. Overwhelming force. Relentless pressure. Enemy fleets eventually broke. They always did. But now something unusual was happening. On the bridge of the Iron Judgment, Warlord Kreth Verowyn studied the tactical display in silence. The battlefield was no longer behaving as expected. Status report, Verowyn said. His tactical officer answered immediately. Dominion losses. 9 ships destroyed, 6 heavily damaged. 9 losses in a single engagement was rare, but still acceptable. What about the human fleet? 22 vessels still combat capable. 7 destroyed. Verowyn nodded slowly. The numbers still favored the Dominion. But numbers were not the entire story. The human fleet had pushed deep into the center of the Dominion formation, far deeper than any enemy fleet had ever managed. They were no longer fighting from the outside. They were inside the Dominion battle line. That alone had already complicated the battle. But something else appeared on the display. 3 new signals. Dominion officers began murmuring. What is that? The tactical officer checked the sensor board. His voice shifted slightly. Warlord, those are the remaining defense ships. Verowyn narrowed his eyes. The damaged cruisers from the defeated defense fleet had turned back. Instead of retreating, they were advancing again, toward the Dominion formation. One of Verowyn's officers spoke quietly. They are attempting to support the humans. Verowyn leaned back slightly. Interesting. He tapped the command on the console. Assign 3 cruisers to intercept them. The officer hesitated. Warlord, that will weaken the defensive perimeter around the flagship. Verowyn glanced at the screen. The Iron Judgment remained surrounded by more than 20 warships. Plenty of protection. Do it. Across the battlefield, 3 Dominion cruisers turned away from the main formation and accelerated toward the returning defense ships. On the Vanguard Reach, Lieutenant Kessler saw the movement immediately. Commander, enemy cruisers are moving to intercept. Commander Thur nodded. That was expected. Our job is simply to make them chase us. Behind the 3 defense ships, the human fleet continued advancing deeper into the Dominion formation. Each Dominion vessel that turned to intercept the returning defense ships was one less ship firing at the humans. Across the battlefield, the effect began to show. Human ships were finding small openings. Dominion firing lines were breaking. The formation was losing its shape. On the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Ward watched the shifting battlefield. Enemy cruisers redirecting to intercept the defense ships, Malik reported. Ward nodded. They're helping. She stepped closer to the tactical board. Show me the flagship. The projection zoomed in. At the center of the Dominion formation floated the massive warship Iron Judgment. It dwarfed every other vessel in the system. Nearly 3 kilometers long. Layers of armor plating. Hundreds of weapons emplacements. And surrounded by a protective ring of Dominion cruisers. Malik studied the defensive pattern. That's a fortress. Ward nodded slightly. Yes. The navigator asked the obvious question. Can we reach it? Ward didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the shifting movements of the Dominion fleet. Ships repositioning. Defensive arcs shifting. Gaps opening and closing. Then she pointed to a narrow corridor forming between two Dominion cruisers. There. Malik leaned closer. That gap won't last long. How long? Ward asked. Malik ran the calculation. Maybe 10 seconds. Ward nodded. That's enough. She turned toward the bridge crew. Signal the fleet. Malik looked up. Orders. Ward spoke calmly. All ships focus on the flagship. The navigator blinked. Direct assault? Yes. The room went quiet. Outside the viewport, explosions flashed across the battlefield. Human ships were already damaged, some barely operational, and now she was sending them deeper into the center of the Dominion fleet. Malik broke the silence. Enemy ships will concentrate their fire on us. Ward nodded. I know. She looked at the tactical display again. The battle ends when that ship falls. No one argued. Across the human fleet, the order spread instantly. All ships target the Dominion flagship. On the Iron Judgment, the tactical officer's voice changed suddenly. Warlord, the human fleet is redirecting toward the flagship. The projection shifted. 22 human ships were now accelerating toward the center of the Dominion formation, toward the Iron Judgment. They are ignoring the outer defensive ships. Another officer spoke. They are accepting direct fire from our cruisers. Verwin watched the sensor display closely. Human ships were being hit repeatedly. Several had taken heavy damage. But they kept moving. Closer. Closer. They were not retreating. They were not slowing. One of the officers spoke quietly. They are willing to lose their entire fleet if it means reaching us. Verwin stood slowly. The bridge fell silent. For the first time in 40 years of command, the Dominion warlord understood something new about his enemy. Humans did not fight like other species. They did not retreat when the odds turned against them. They did not surrender when the battle was lost. They did something far more dangerous. They kept going. There was no Dominion military term for what he was watching. No doctrine that addressed it. No strategy that had ever been designed to counter it. Because in 40 years, he had never needed one. Every other species, when cornered and outgunned, had made the rational calculation. Humans, apparently, did not make that calculation. They made a different one entirely. Verwin turned toward his officers. Reinforce the defensive ring. Several Dominion ships began tightening their formation around the Iron Judgment. Weapons charging. Targeting systems locking onto the approaching human fleet. But the damage had already been done. The Dominion fleet had stopped advancing. It had shifted into a defensive posture. And that single change meant something very important. On the Vanguard reach, Commander Thur noticed it immediately. Lieutenant Kessler. Yes, Commander? Look at the Dominion formation. Kessler zoomed the display. Her eyes widened. They're pulling inward. Yes. Thur folded his arms slowly. The Dominion fleet is defending its flagship. Kessler looked up. That means. Thur finished the thought quietly. They're afraid of losing it. Across the battlefield, the human fleet pushed forward through fire and wreckage. The turning point had arrived. The Dominion fleet was no longer trying to win the battle. Now it was trying not to lose it. The Dominion flagship Iron Judgment dominated the center of the battlefield. At nearly 3 kilometers long, it looked less like a warship and more like a moving fortress. Thick armor plates layered its hull in overlapping segments, each one designed to absorb the kind of punishment that destroyed ordinary vessels. For 2 centuries, no enemy fleet had ever reached it. Now 22 damaged human ships were closing in. On the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Elena Ward studied the tactical display carefully. The Dominion defensive ring around the flagship had tightened. Cruisers and destroyers moved into position, forming overlapping firing arcs that protected the massive warship from every direction. But the human fleet had already penetrated too deep into the formation. Some of the defensive ships were out of position. Others were already damaged. Small openings were appearing. Ward pointed at the display. There. Navigator Tara Owens leaned closer. Between 2 Dominion cruisers, a narrow corridor had opened for just a moment as the ships repositioned. Owens ran the calculation instantly. That window lasts 8 seconds. Take it. Owens didn't hesitate. The Resolute Dawn accelerated sharply. The ship tilted slightly as its engines pushed beyond their standard combat limits. Warning indicators flashed across the helm console. Engine stress rising, Owens said. Maintain speed, Ward replied. Outside the viewport, Two Dominion cruisers loomed ahead like enormous walls of steel. Their weapons were already charging. Lieutenant Malik locked onto the nearest ship. "They're targeting us." Ward nodded once. "Return fire." The forward guns erupted. Heavy railgun rounds slammed into the cruiser's shields just as both Dominion ships fired. Plasma blasts streaked past the Resolute Dawn. One shot struck the hull. The bridge shook violently. Warning alarms filled the room. "Hull breach on deck 4, someone shouted. Owens held the course steady. 3 seconds to the gap. Another Dominion blast struck the ship's outer armor. Metal screamed somewhere deep inside the vessel. Still the Resolute Dawn kept accelerating. "Now!" Owens shouted. The human flagship shot through the narrow corridor between the two cruisers. Both enemy ships tried to turn their weapons. Too late. The Resolute Dawn burst into open space directly in front of the Dominion flagship. On the Iron Judgment, the tactical officer stared at the screen. "Warlord, the human flagship has broken through." The massive projection showed the Resolute Dawn less than 200 kilometers away. For ships of that size, it was almost point-blank range. Veruin watched the approaching vessel carefully. "Bring all forward batteries online." Across the enormous Dominion ship, weapon systems activated. Dozens of cannons rotated toward the approaching human vessel. The Resolute Dawn fired first. Every forward weapon on the ship unleashed a concentrated barrage. Railgun rounds and missiles slammed into the side of the Iron Judgment. The flagship's shields flared violently. Several outer armor plates cracked under the impact. On the Dominion bridge, alarms began sounding. Shield integrity dropping. Port armor section damaged. Veruin remained perfectly still. "Return fire." The Iron Judgment answered with devastating force. Heavy plasma cannons struck the Resolute Dawn repeatedly. One engine pod exploded. The ship lurched sideways under the impact. On the human bridge, sparks showered from a damaged control panel. Engine pod destroyed. Structural damage across multiple decks. Ward steadied herself against the command rail. "Helm, hold position." Owens looked up in disbelief. "Admiral, match their speed." The navigator understood immediately. If they pulled away now, the Dominion flagship would bring all its long-range weapons to bear. But at extremely close range, some of those weapons could no longer fire safely. Owens adjusted the controls. The Resolute Dawn drifted closer to the enormous Dominion ship. Soon the two vessels were less than 50 meters apart. Massive armor plates of the Iron Judgment filled the viewport entirely. Malik studied the targeting screen. "At this distance we can hit the hull directly." Ward stepped beside him. She examined the armor plating carefully. Dominion warships were built with overlapping plates that reinforced each other. But every armor system had seams. Ward pointed at one narrow line between two massive plates. "There." Malik zoomed the image. "That section protects internal troop compartments." Ward nodded. "If we breach it, their boarding forces are trapped inside." Malik smiled slightly. "That will complicate things for them." He locked the targeting reticle onto the seam. "Battery 2 ready. Fire." 3 railgun rounds struck the exact same point. The first impact dented the armor. The second cracked it open. The third punched straight through. Inside the Iron Judgment, a long corridor full of armored Dominion soldiers stood waiting to be deployed. They had heard the battle outside. They had felt the ship shudder from impacts. They were ready. They never heard the third round coming. The explosion tore through the troop compartment. Emergency systems activated instantly. On the Dominion bridge, a tactical officer shouted. "Troop section breached. Reserve forces unable to deploy." Veruin stared at the damage report. The humans had found a weakness and exploited it instantly. On the Resolute Dawn, Ward issued her next command. "Prepare boarding teams." Several officers looked up. Boarding the flagship? Yes. At this distance, the two ships were practically touching. Magnetic docking clamps extended from the Resolute Dawn. They locked onto the damaged section of the Dominion flagship. Across the hull, the metal groaned under the pressure. Inside the human assault bay, Sergeant Marcus Hale stood with another team of soldiers. They had already captured one Dominion ship earlier in the battle. Now they were about to enter the largest warship in the enemy fleet. One of the soldiers checked the tactical screen. "How many Dominion crew on that ship?" A technician answered over the comm channel. "Estimated 2,000. The soldier exhaled slowly. "That's a lot." Hale nodded. "We're not here for all of them." He lifted his weapon. "We're here for the bridge." The docking clamps locked into place. The assault hatch opened. 10 humans stepped into the flagship of the Dominion fleet. Outside the flagship, the rest of the battle continued. Human ships were still fighting across the Dominion formation. Several were burning. Some had lost engines, but they kept firing. On the Vanguard Reach, Commander Thur watched the tactical board. "Commander," Kessler said quietly. Thur nodded. "I see it." The Resolute Dawn had attached itself to the Dominion flagship. Moments later, the sensor board showed something else. Dominion ships were beginning to shift their formation again, but not outward, inward. They were pulling back toward the Iron Judgment, trying to protect it. Thur folded his arms slowly. "The flagship is in trouble." Kessler looked up. "What happens if it falls?" Thur answered quietly. "The Dominion fleet loses command." He watched the tactical display carefully. Then something else appeared. A Dominion cruiser at the edge of the formation suddenly powered its engines. Kessler zoomed the signal. "Commander, that ship is preparing for faster-than-light jump." Thur stared at the display. "They're retreating." The cruiser vanished in a flash of light. A second ship followed. Then another. Across the battlefield, the Dominion formation began to unravel. Without command coordination, individual captains were making their own decisions. Some stayed and fought. Others fled. The human fleet continued pressing forward. On the Iron Judgment, Warlord Verowan watched the departures register on the tactical display. His officers waited for orders. For the first time in 40 years of command, the battle was no longer under his control. Verowan stood silently for several seconds. He thought of the fleet that had come without a distress signal. From 2 weeks away, he thought of ships that flew straight into a barrage without flinching. He thought of soldiers who boarded a vessel with 2,000 crew members and called the odds acceptable. He thought of 22 broken ships that were still, right now, at this very moment, accelerating toward him. He thought of a species that apparently did not know what a lost battle looked like. Or perhaps they knew exactly what it looked like, and simply didn't care. "Prepare jump coordinates." The bridge crew froze. "Warlord, retreat." Verowan did not raise his voice. "Yes." The enormous Dominion flagship began charging its faster-than-light engines. Outside the hull, human soldiers were still fighting their way deeper into the ship. Across the battlefield, the remaining Dominion ships began disengaging. The Battle of Kelry's Prime was ending, and the Dominion fleet was leaving. The battle ended the way storms often ended in deep space. Not with a final explosion, but with silence. Across the Kelry system, weapons fire slowly faded. Dominion ships that had not already retreated began powering down their weapons and drifting away from the battlefield. Several damaged vessels attempted emergency faster-than-light jumps. Others simply floated in place, their crews trapped inside sealed compartments. The enormous flagship Iron Judgment vanished last. Its engines flared brightly as it escaped into faster-than-light travel, abandoning dozens of damaged ships behind it. When the light faded, the battlefield fell completely still. Debris drifted slowly through the orbit of Kelry's Prime. Fragments of destroyed ships, broken weapons, silent hulls that would never fly again. The battle had lasted just over 2 hours, but the debris field would remain for decades. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Elena Ward finally allowed herself to breathe. Damage reports filled every screen. Forward engine pod destroyed. Shield generators offline. Multiple hull breaches across decks 3 through 6. Ward listened carefully to each report. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Crew casualties?" The medical officer answered quietly. 11 confirmed. Ward lowered her head slightly. The bridge remained silent for several seconds. Then she nodded once. "Stand down all weapons." Around the ship, the tension slowly began to release. For the first time since entering the system, the crew allowed themselves to relax. Navigator Tara Owens leaned back from the helm console. Her hands were still shaking slightly. "Good flying," Ward said. Owens looked up. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. Then she simply nodded. "Thank you, Admiral." Across the fleet, similar scenes unfolded. Damaged human ships moved slowly into holding positions. Repair teams rushed through corridors, sealing hull breaches. Medical crews treated the wounded. Several ships would require weeks of repair before they could travel again, but they were still there, and the colony world below them was safe. 6 hours later, a small meeting was held aboard the damaged cruiser Vanguard Reach. Temporary lighting illuminated the scarred interior of the ship. Several blast doors had been sealed. Emergency power hummed through exposed wiring along the walls. Commander Rollin Thur stood near the docking port as the airlock opened. Admiral Ward stepped inside with two officers behind her. Her uniform was slightly burned along one sleeve. A medical sling supported her left arm, but her expression remained calm. For several seconds, the two commanders simply looked at each other. Finally, Thur spoke. "Admiral Ward." Ward nodded politely. "Commander." Thur folded his hands behind his back. "I have spent the last 6 hours trying to decide what to say to you." Ward waited. Thur glanced briefly at the tactical display showing the wreckage outside. No distress signal reached Earth. No request for assistance was ever sent. He looked back at her. "Yet your fleet arrived anyway." The room was quiet. Finally, Thur asked the question that had been on his mind since the battle ended. "Why?" Ward considered the question carefully. She had expected it. Her answer came without hesitation. "Because you needed help." Thur raised one eyebrow slightly. "There are many battles across the galaxy that need help." Ward nodded. "Yes." Thur waited. Ward looked through the viewport at the debris field surrounding the planet. Thousands of lives had been lost there, but the colony below was still alive. Then she spoke quietly. "Most commanders look at a situation like this and decide it's already too late." She turned back to him. "We came because we hadn't decided that yet." The room remained silent. For a moment, Thur simply studied her. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the interior of the ship. "In that case, Admiral." He allowed a faint smile. "We have a great deal to discuss." 3 days later, Lieutenant Mara Kessler completed the full tactical analysis of the battle. She ran the calculations 11 times. The results never changed. Every predictive model agreed. The human fleet should have lost. The Dominion fleet had superior numbers, superior firepower, and better strategic positioning. Statistically, the human victory had been impossible. Kessler stared at the final report for several minutes. Then she opened a second file. She wrote only 2 sentences. "The models are not incorrect. Humans simply do not believe them." She saved the file and finally went to sleep. Far away in Dominion space, a military intelligence database updated its records that same night. The entry for the human species changed. Previous classification: Category 3, Emerging Civilization. New classification: Category 9, Unrestricted Strategic Threat. There was no Category 10. The Dominion had never needed one before.